I am Jim Collison, and this is Gallup's Call to Coach, recorded on February 18th, 2022. Call to Coach is a resource for those who want to help others discover and use their strengths. We have Gallup experts and independent strengths coaches share tactics, insights, and strategies to help coaches maximize the talent of individuals, teams, and organizations around the world. If you're listening live, love to have you join us in our chat room. There's just a link right above me there, and sign in. We'd love to have your questions, especially today in chat. A lot of interaction, or at least possibility of it. I guess it depends on you if you interact with us. We'd love to have that. If you're listening after the fact or as a podcast, you can send us an email with your questions. Just send that to coaching@gallup.com. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app or there on YouTube so you never miss an episode. Dean Jones is our host today. Dean is the Global Talent Development Architect and a Senior Learning Expert for Gallup. Also the Chair of Gallup's Diversity Council. And Dean, always great to have you on Called to Coach, and welcome back.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. It's good to be here today.
Dean, we're talking a little bit about branding and personal branding and your brand as a coach today. And I'm pretty excited about this topic because I have a lot of passion around it and what I do and the work that I'm doing. So I'm super excited about what you have to teach me today. But can you spend when we talk about this idea of brand or personal brand, can you give us a little bit of just kind of an introduction so folks know where we're going?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we were talking about what to talk about today, right? Where we should go today. This is actually a piece of work that I do with some of our consultants internally, thinking about what is your brand, thinking about it, and really having it be rooted in your contribution. So and we thought it'd be really useful for coaches as you're thinking about yourself, as you think about your work, and you think about being known in the communities that you traffic in. How do you be known for your contribution? How do you be known for really what it is, what the difference that you want to make? And at your core, I think one of the cool advantages that we have in this conversation about branding is being able to think about this through a talents and strengths lens helps us, I think, to really ground our personal brand in something that's really meaningful. So today we thought we'd just kind of talk a little bit about this. I think it's useful, as you're engaging with this conversation. I think it's useful in a number of different ways. I think it's useful if you're establishing your practice as a coach, or reestablishing it, or trying to kind of refine what is my practice, or where should I be focusing. I think it's useful if you're in a conversation about marketing yourself. So thinking about how do I want to be known, and what should my brand be, and how should I be marketing myself? I think it's useful if you're looking for a job. I think if this is something, and I hope, and I expect, as I was going through this, I thought, these are conversations not only that you would sort of apply to yourself, and I hope you do, right? But also that you might do this kind of work with other people, right? So there may be people you're coaching that you're doing this kind of work about. And then fundamentally, I guess because at my heart, I really care about development. I think it's a useful conversation just to get clear about who you are, as a human being, and why you're on the planet. I think there's a nice branding sometimes comes across as sort of a superficial conversation, or something that's not really core to who you are. But I think there's a big connection to, who you are in terms of your values and your talents and your calling in life, right? So I think if you think about this long enough, I think there's a cool way of being able to really gives you an angle on who am I and what difference do I want to make in the world. So that's where I think this is sort of useful.
Dean, from a internal standpoint at Gallup, when we're onboarding, we actually spend a bunch of time talking and thinking about, for every employee, their own personal brand. I think when I first was exposed to that, I was kind of like, this is kind of weird, am I not already in the organization? Like, am I not already, like, why would I, what's the importance, just as we think about coaches working with individuals in an organization where they may not have a job, they already have a job. They're not, they maybe kind of like, I'm not an influencer in this organization. Why would I? Can you talk a little bit about the importance of just kind of personal brand, even when you may not be in that role in an organization where that's important?
Yeah, I love that. That's such a good question, Jim. You're really good at this. I think you got a future here.
Thanks.
Um,
I've been doing it for a week or two. So
No, but it's such a good question because it is kind of a funny conversation. It is kind of a funny conversation, and why I love that question is because why? So first of all, why do we spend time teaching that to people who are new consultants at Gallup? Right. The reason that we do that is because one is Gallup's a pretty flat organization, not a very structured, not a very hierarchical organization. We really function where, like most organizations, we're highly matrixed and we're relatively flat. And we really count on people being able to kind of build connections inside the organization for the work that they do. And they honestly have a lot of freedom to be able to do that. And part of how people are successful, and you see this not only with other professional services firms, but you see this in a lot of organizations now, is they're able to generate a brand inside the organization where people know them relative to their contributions. And so for our consultants, man, that's a core part of your livelihood, is you got to be able to be somebody who can do that and do that successfully inside the organization. If you can't get connected, you have a really hard time getting traction, right? I also think it's an important conversation for anybody that wants to think about, how do I create influence in the community? I always laugh because I look at business books all the time, right? And there's that whole genre of business books that is written for people that don't have influencing themes and want to figure out how to influence others, right? And I always think it's always this, like, it's trying to decode, what it is that people that naturally have a lot of influencing themes would say, yeah, I just do that, right? But I think it's an important conversation about, how do I start to be known in a community? When we start having this conversation, let me just kind of dig into it a little bit. One of the ways I like to get in this conversation is have people think about communities, right? And specifically, you start to think about, one of the questions I'll ask is, how is a community different than a crowd? How is a community different than a crowd? So when you think about this, what are some of the things that you would say are make a community different than a crowd? By the way, if you're listening live and you want to throw some of this in chat, we're happy to include it. But one of the things that you see that is different about a community than a crowd is a community in a crowd, people showing up at the same place, right? Or that happen to be in the same place. With a community, there's that sense of shared purpose. So there's something with a community where there's that sense of shared purpose, that we're all here and we didn't just show up at the same place, because of our disparate purposes, right? We've got sort of a shared purpose kind of being together. The other question I like to ask is, how is a community different than a small group? And one of the things you notice is different with a community. Yeah, Jess Burkhart said, in a community, there's shared values and expectations. Justin said, community feels interconnected. Yeah, exactly. So there's that kind of in a community, there's that kind of shared purpose, that kind of shared values, shared expectations. The other kind of question is, how is a community different than a small group? So as you think about a community versus a small group, and one of the key ways that communities are different than a small group is, in a small group, you're likely to be able to know each person individually. You're likely to have a direct relationship with each person. In a community, you don't necessarily have a direct relationship with each person. So one of the challenges that people encounter when they go to interact, or when they go to say, hey, I'm going to go interact with the community, is they don't, they may be anchored by that shared purpose, but they don't know how do you be known in the community? How do you interact with the community when you don't have a direct relationship with every single person, right? And So, and that's really hard for people. I think in a lot of places, people feel that that's really challenging. There's some people that I think naturally they have kind of influencing themes, and it's kind of like, hey, I'm going to go be known by this community or like that. And in some cases, people go to do that, and it goes kind of sideways, right? So they're not known in the ways that they'd like to be known, or known in the ways that they think that are actually powerful for them to be known. So I think there's different ways you can be known in a community. So one way you can be known in a community is you think about, like, okay, if I'm going to go interact with this community, I want to have some influence in this community, and particularly I want to contribute something to this community. I think there's different ways that you can be known in a community. One way you can be known in a community is as a stereotype. And we know that stereotypes are sort of shorthand that clump together a group of people. The definition of a stereotype, or one of the definitions of a stereotype, is a fixed idea that many people have about a thing or a group that may often be untrue or only partly true, right? Stereotypes are sort of shorthand ways of clumping together groups, right? The example I use when I teach this internally is like, and I'm not picking on anybody, but I kind of am picking on people. It's kind of like, okay, we know what the accountants are like, right? Okay, and there's a stereotype. Okay, we know what the accountants are like, right? Or we know what the developers are like, right? So those are shorthand ways that are often untrue or only partly true. And the problem with it is it doesn't give us much power. And if I feel like I'm stuck in a stereotype, it doesn't allow me really to contribute beyond that, right? The other way you might be known in a community is to be known as a reputation, as to be known by your reputation. And we all talk about, hey, do I have a good reputation or a bad reputation? The definition of reputation is a widespread belief that someone or something has around a particular habit or characteristic, right? A widespread belief that someone or something has a particular habit or characteristic. And again, with reputation isn't necessarily always empowering. It isn't always particularly useful, and it doesn't allow us to be able to do the work that we want to do. So this is where we start to encourage people to think about themselves in terms of their brand. So rather than being known as a stereotype, rather than being known as some characteristic that you have, he says a lot, right? Or he takes up all the oxygen in the room, talks too much, right? But is that you start to actually actively think about, what is my brand? What is my brand in the community? Now, the definition of a brand, or one of the definitions of a brand, is a particular identity or image regarded as an asset. Let me say that again. A particular identity or image regarded as an asset. And part of the reason that I like that is we're thinking about, how are we and the work that we do an asset to the community? And remember, organizations are just like big communities, right? And so whether you're thinking about the marketplace, big community, whether you're thinking about an organization, community, right? You're thinking about, what is my brand, or how can I be an asset or be known as an asset to the community? I think that's particularly a powerful conversation. And it calls you to not just think about, hey, how am I going to get more people to buy services from me? Or how am I going to get people to like me? Or how am I going to just be known so that people know what I do and how I do it? But how am I going to be an asset or a contribution to the community? Inside this notion of brand, we talk oftentimes about your personal brand. So what is your personal brand? And that's a big thing, I think, for people that are coaches. Inside of your brand is something that we call a brand promise. So a brand promise, one of the definitions of a brand promise that I thought was useful, is a brand promise is the value or experience that your customers can expect to have every single time they have an interaction with you. Let me say that again. It's the value or experience that your customers can expect to have every single time that they have an interaction with you. Now, if you're a consultant at Gallup, we want you to think about that a lot, right? If you're a consultant at Gallup, we want to think about, hey, every time clients interact with you, what is the experience that they have? If you're a strengths coach or a consultant, you want to be thinking about what is the experience that your customers can expect to have every single time they interact with you. That's your brand promise, right? And the more you can deliver on that promise, the stronger the value of your brand is in the minds of your customers. So the more consistent it is, the more powerful it is, the more that you can deliver on that promise of value, the stronger your brand will be, right? So part of it is then thinking about, let me just pause for a second, but part of that is just thinking about, okay, if I want to be known in the community, what's the most powerful way, or what's a powerful way that I can be known in the community? Whether the community is inside of a big organization, whether the community is the marketplace, whether it's a community of whether it's in a geographic community. If I want to be known in the community, I'm not going to have a direct relationship with everybody, right? And what's the most powerful way that I could be known? Well, one powerful way is to be known as an asset to that community. In other words, what's the contribution I could be to that community? And what is the experience then that I want people to have? So inside of being an asset, what's the promise that I want to make? Or what's the promise that I want to be known for? Where people could say, hey, every single time that I interact with that person, I can expect to receive this kind of value, right? Let me just pause there, Jim. Any comments or questions on this?
We'll give the chat room a second if they want to jump in there with some comments. Dean, I think my own personal example in some ways, when I kind of in 2011, 2012, when I started jumping into the strengths community, I remember one day an email came out from our customer support group who said, who is this guy and why is he answering questions on Facebook? Right. I hadn't built any brand. I had just I wanted to be helpful. I thought I was being helpful, but it would take some time of some consistency, right, to build into that. And that I just always think back to those days and like, why is this guy doing this? We've never seen this before, right? Today, fast forward to today, now I get a handful of emails a day from that same team looking for, hey, what do we want to do here? How do we want to answer this? What's the message we want to use? And so that has been, for me some growth in brand. It's just like I had a coach reach out to me the other day that said, this was maybe a year or so ago, so pretty recent, say, your woo in email a little bit different than your woo in person. In other words, you're a little short, right? You're a little short on your emails. And it was just a good reminder, Dean, as we talk about this, it was a good reminder to me, some self-awareness that, yeah, that's not a strength of mine. We're going to talk a little bit about this here in a second as we think about using your writing is not my strength. So, but speaking to people is. And so I've spent some time over the last 6 months now when I have a situation where where communication is critical. I try to make a personal contact rather than do it via email, right? Some awareness around my own personal brand. I'm not going to win via email. I'm going to win when we're talking face to face. That's my personal brand. That's at least how I see it. I don't know.
I love that. I think that's great. Yeah, I love that. I think, and part of it is cultivating that awareness. I think part of, as you think about it, we got some great comments. Steve Shroud said in the chat, brand, be real and never deviate. Part of it, Steve, to your point, and I think this is the point that Jim was making, is part of your brand comes from who are you authentically, right? And that it's not some made up thing like I'm gonna come up with some brand that I want to be known at, that's some made up thing. It's really got to be a function of who you are authentically, and at the same time having some good awareness around it. Marina asked, how do you include your strengths into building your brand promise? And in fact, Marina, that's a great question. Let me talk a little bit about that. I think the way to think about your brand, and particularly your brand promise, is to really look at your strengths. Now, part of this, and I'm going to talk about this a little later, but part of it is you, as you start to think about your brand and your brand promise, you have to think about what is uniquely my brand promise. Or in other words, how am I different in my brand than everybody else? What is the thing that I uniquely contribute? It sounds like a horrible thing to say, but Strengths Coach is not a differentiated brand, right? That's not a unique brand, right? We've got 14,000 certified strengths coaches around the world. Just saying I'm a strengths coach, that's useful. That's a great attribute. But okay, you're a strengths coach. Yeah, but what is the work that you do? Who do you do that work for? What's the unique value that you provide? So thinking about your brand promise, you got to figure out, okay, well, how do I figure out what is the unique value that I provide, or what is it that people can count on me for? What is my brand promise? I think it's useful to be able to start that and really dive into your strengths and to really look at your talent themes and look at your strengths. I did this exercise. So when I was preparing for our conversation today, I did this exercise with myself, right? If you look at my top 5, so my top 5 are activator, focus, woo, strategic, and relator, right? So I looked at each one of my top 5 and said, okay, well, what is the thing that I contribute? What is the thing that and these are things that not only I contribute, but I like to contribute, right? I'm passionate about contributing. With my activator, I'm comfortable moving ideas to action. And people sort of know me as a guy that bring me in to be able to initiate something. And part of that is if you need energy and momentum around something, I'm your guy, right? So I use my activator talent that way. With my focus, a lot of my focus is contributing a lot of intentionality around something. So if you need the kind of intentionality, the kind of push behind it, along with that is a real strong focus and prioritization. If what you need, one of the things I contribute is a lot of focus and prioritization. Another big thing is I have a big goal orientation. I've talked about goal setting a lot. It's something I'm super passionate about. I think it comes directly out of my focus talent, and my strength around focus. Big goal orientation. Where are we going? What's the goal? Where's the focus and the priority around that? My woo's number 3, my ability to win people over and to be able to build agreement around something that people go, oh yeah, this is something we should do. My strategic talent is that I'm comfortable being able to think about the way forward and come up with the best plan. My relator, that I build deep, close relationships. I'm somebody that's comfortable building close relationships, and I tend to have those relationships that I carry forward in time. So I part of what I did was I just simply went through my top 5 and said, okay, what is the contribution there? Not necessarily what's the talent, but what's the thing that I contribute to the teams that I'm on, the projects that I'm on, the people that I work with. What is the thing that I contribute around each one of those? And then I started kind of, looking at all that, I started to look and say, okay, if you asked me, what is the contribution that you are, Dean, in the work that you're doing? Or what's the contribution? The thing I wrote really was a statement that started to kind of sum that up, right? So here's what I wrote. You can count on me to be an initiator, a builder, somebody that contributes energy and intentionality. I'll help win over stakeholders, remove barriers, and create close, trusted relationships with key partners. I'll help us define where we're going and the best way to get there, right? So that's my kind of short statement around that. So why am I telling you this? I think it's a useful exercise for you to do. I think it's a useful exercise that you take your top 5 or your top 10 talent themes and go by one and say, how do I contribute this? How do I contribute this? What is the contribution that I am in this area? And write those things out and then start to synthesize them together to be able to say, okay, well, what does this say about who you are? What is it that it says about who you are? I took all those from my top 5 and synthesized those into 3 statements. I think Jim's putting some of them into chat here, right? But to be able to do that, it starts to give you a handle on, okay, what's your brand, right? And the value of this, I think, is understanding your brand through the lens of what is the contribution that you are? What is it the thing that people can count on you to contribute, and start to get a handle on where is it unique? So I think that, and as part of that, is also figuring out the not only the value you provide or the contribution you are, but also what you don't contribute, right? The value that you don't, what is it that you can't count on me for, right? That's not the thing. I know for myself, right? With my themes, I have a lot of influencing themes. I'm not the guy that's going to be listening for consensus. That's not part of my brand, is to listen for consensus or build consensus. That's not who I am. Harmony is very low for me. It just never occurs to me to walk into a room and say, hey, let's build consensus. And that's what I really lean into my partners around, right? So I think it's useful to be able to do this. Let me just pause, Jim. Any comments or questions on this one?
Yeah, again, I'll give them a second to do that and drop those there in chat. In my example, Dean, it was a shift as I began to realize I'm not a gifted writer and I don't communicate well that way. So it wasn't a matter of just stopping doing it, but start leaning into those areas that I do it better, communicating, having time with people one-on-one, but then leaning into my partners who could do this. Like, hey, would you provide, I have some written stuff. Can you provide the copy to me? Because that's just, I'm not going to do it as good as you are. Right. In really leaning into that, not like you said, knowing what I don't do. I'm not going to be one who's going to write fabulous things for you. Just not going to happen. So I love that clarity around that, not just what I bring, but what I need. And, well, we've heard that before, right?
Yeah.
Right. So this great opportunity then to say, how can others help me in my own brand too, as well? Some stuff coming in on chat. Anything you want to highlight there?
Yeah, John says this sounds like an exercise. Yes, this is an exercise, and I think it's a useful exercise for you to do. I think it's also something, John, that you could do with clients, right? Steve, you started to write yours. The thing that I would, as you write yours, I'm going to coach you a little bit here, okay? So you've got, I'm a strengths-oriented leader. I'm a generous resource. I'm a creative strategist. I'm an objective observer. I'm a conscientious responder. That's beautiful, right? One of the things I think about it as you start to do this is more about who you are versus what you contribute. So when you do this exercise, you want to be thinking about, what is it that I contribute to others inside of this? I think you're almost there, but I think it's taking it the next step to say, okay, if I'm a generous resource, what is the contribution that I am, right? So I think it starts with thinking about not just what's the moniker or what's the way you would describe me, right? But what's the contribution that I am for others? So I think that's the first part of this. First part of like really looking at your strengths as the basis for your brand promise is to think about, in each one of those talent themes, in each one of those dominant talent themes, what's the thing you contribute? The next step on this is, yeah, and Naomi put in chat, like, the distinction between who you are and what you contribute. Yes, Naomi nailed it. Yes, that's exactly it, right? So I think that's really useful. Lindsay wrote, an incredible exercise in theme dynamics. Yes, absolutely. Because part of what we're asking you to do is, as you look at each one of those themes and what you contribute, then as you start to synthesize it together, oh, Steve, you're so generous. Thank you. As you synthesize it together, you're thinking about, there's that lens on theme dynamics, and I think it helps you to kind of think about, how do all these themes aggregate up into the contribution that I am. Then the next step, I think, is, so first you've really thought, you've looked at your strengths and thought about what you contribute. Now I'm going to have you think about it in a different way. So it's the same thing, only you're going to look at it from the different sides. So I'd like you to think about what's the value that you provide, or said a little more rigorously, what is the value that people derive from working with you, right? Now that's different than what you contribute, right? It sounds like it's the same thing, but it's not. So there's the thing you contribute, but then there's also the value that people get out of working with you. And in order to think about that, people always want to say, well, I contribute this, or I'm this for people, right? No, right? That's not necessarily the value that they get. Sometimes it is, but mostly you got to think about, okay, what is what is the value that your clients, whether or your internal customers, get from working with you, right? What's the thing that they would say about you is the value that they get, right? It might be part of the value I get from working with Jim is knowing that he always follows through, right? That he's incredibly reliable. Now, Jim may not think, hey, Jim may not think, hey, I contribute reliability, but that's the part of the value that people are deriving from working with you, right? So part of it is the first step is really thinking about what do you aim to contribute and how is that rooted in your strengths? Then the second thing is really looking at the other side of that. Now, in order to look at that, you got to put yourself in your clients' or customers' shoes. You got to put yourself in their shoes and say, what is the value that they get from working with me? What is the value? What do they walk away with? A lot of times you got to go ask them. A lot of times, one of the useful things is to start to do interviews with people. I was just, my friend Doug Bacon, who's one of our certified coaches, he's an executive coach. He's based in Charlotte, North Carolina. Was telling me the other day about when he was really in an inquiry around this. And he ended up doing 35 interviews with different people that he had worked with to be able to understand more of the value that people get from working with him. And, he's asking people these questions, what is the value that I provide? One of the things he said to me that I think is funny and Southern and a great way of capturing this is he said, when you're in the bottle, it's hard to read the label, right? And when you're in the bottle, you can't see the label, right? So you kind of got to ask people, okay, what is it, right? What is it about me? Mm-hmm. And the kind of questions that I would be asking people, and I, by the way, I think this is a great exercise for all of us, just period, right? Is what is the value that I provide? What can you count on me for? When I show up, what can you count on that I'm going to provide, right? What is it that you think I contribute to our work together? And I think I'm going to say those questions again because I think they're important. What's the value that I provide? And sometimes that comes a little esoteric. So I love being able to ask people, what can you count on me for? What can you count on me to provide? And, another question I think a funny one to ask, but a good one is, when everybody gets together and they're talking about me and what I contribute, what is it the thing that they say? When everybody gets together and I'm not there and they're talking about what I contribute, what is the thing that people always remark on? Mm-hmm. Right? So starting to ask people, hey, what is that thing? And I think it's useful for you to know, sometimes the thing that you contribute, sometimes the place that where people get value isn't the thing that you expect to contribute. Let me say that again. Sometimes the value that you provide or the value that people take away isn't the thing that you expected to contribute. And I think that's really a useful thing to know, because when you're clear about the value that you provide, it's something that you can lean into. It's also then it's part of your brand, right? And allows you to be able to do that. I can see we got a bunch of stuff happening in the chat here, Jim.
Yeah. So Steve says a brand should be aspirational and inspirational. And thinking about too, I love that question of what would you miss if I stopped working with you? Like if my services weren't available to you today, what would you miss the most? In working with some folks on our team, I said some things and to some of our partners, and I have a particular partner, Mark, who actually does all the transcriptions for Called to Coach. He'll say to me from time to time, you know what? I'm going to tell that person, like I'll say, man, they are great because they did this. Right. And he's like, I think I'm going to tell them that because it's important that they know. And I think that's some of what we're trying to get to is what's being said about you, not maybe necessarily even with you there, that people, what are people relying on for? What are they seeing in you outside of a traditional recognition cycle or whatever? So what else are you seeing coming in the chat room there, Dean?
Yeah, the chat, you guys, you really have it. This is really cool. Brea said, what problem do you solve? Asking people, what's the problem you think I solve? Or how do I do Danette said, I was in a comms training long ago and the trainer called it afters. Why are they better off after we've done the work, right? Tudum Leadership Consulting Coaching said, a few years back, I asked family and friends, who do you get when you get me in the room? And you got some really insightful responses around that, right? Trish loved what you said, Jim, about what would you miss if you stopped working with me? So it's really useful to kind of go through and say, hey, what's the value that people get, and really listening for that. Where people, I will tell you, just having taught this a lot, right? Where people get tangled up in this is they always want to write down the things that they contribute or what they offer versus listening for, no, what's the value that people get? What are they really getting out of it? Those are two different things. And you got to be able to distinguish those things. And even after I've said that, and then I ask people to say, hey, what is the value? People still want to talk about what they offer or what they contribute. So I think it's useful, by the way, to know what you contribute and what you're intending to contribute. But the other piece of it is really knowing, hey, what's the value that people derive? One of the this is a very old example, but I'm going to use it anyway, is, but years and years ago, I worked in the technology industry, right? And there used to be this joke among IT people that you never got fired for choosing Microsoft, right? Mm-hmm. Like if people said, hey, what should we go with? And you said, well, I think we should go with Microsoft. It was the safest choice in the world, right? And part of the value proposition was for IT people at the time was that it was a safe choice, right? And that's probably not the value that Microsoft intended, but it's certainly one that they capitalized on, right? And it was certainly useful to know is, hey, this is a safe choice, right? So I think it's important that you're thinking about not just what do you intend to contribute, but then what's the value you derive. Mm-hmm. The other piece of that then is what makes you unique. So how is that value unique, and how is it unique from the other people you compete with? How is it unique in among your marketplace? How is it differentiated? We did some work years ago when we were doing some work around customer engagement. And one of the big discoveries we had at that point was it was more important to be different than it was to be better. That if you wanted to engage customers, just saying, hey, I'm better than the competition wasn't very engaging. But if you could clearly say how you were different than the competition, that was much more likely to create engagement than just saying that it was better than the competition, right? And I think it's important for you to be clear how you're different. This is one of the things I think, as long as I've been working with strengths coaches, that I've encouraged strengths coaches to do, is to think about what is your differentiated offering? What is the way that you are offering something unique? And part of that may be, who do you serve? So who are your customers? Who benefits most from your services? Who are the people that you want to work with? I was working with a coach here in town for a long time, for a period of about 6 months or a year. And she was really interesting. She passionate about strengths, very, very talented coach. And we were talking about, I asked her, who really is it that you love working with? And she said, I love working with people that are going through a job transition. Mm-hmm. She said, it's funny, but when people are going through that job transition, mm-hmm. that really seems to be a great time for me to offer coaching. I love coaching people and I'm really successful at it. When people work with me, they always get the next best job and they always mm-hmm. find something that's closer to their strengths. Mm-hmm. And she, and I love that because it's clear, right? These are the kind of people I work with. These are the people that most benefit from what I do. And I think it's important for you to be thinking about that, right? For whom do you want to provide value? Who do you want to contribute to? Who gets the most value from the contribution you are? And part of that is, who are you most called to work with? Who are the people that you're most called to work with? And in what context? I think that's an important piece. So there's what you contribute. There's the value that people get out of that. Then thinking about, how is this different? How is this differentiated? How is this unique? And who are the people that are going to benefit best from that? Customers. And what is the unique value that I provide to my customers? What is the unique thing that they take away from me? What is the thing that I want to contribute, that I'm in business to contribute? And who am I? What is my purpose around doing that? All of those pieces together, when you're clear on all those pieces, you're really clear on your value proposition. And that gives you really your brand as a coach, and your brand rooted in your strengths and rooted in the contribution that you are. So again, let's pause. Jim, any other comments or questions that you want to pull out here?
Yeah, and as we give some folks, I think Bria says, yes, features equal what you offer, benefits offer what
Yes.
you get, in a lot of statements around that. I think I want to challenge the coaches too, is when you know that, it gives you the ability to say it confidently in a way that people believe.
Mhm.
Because I've worked with some folks, they may be new to some kind of task, and they offer to help you, and you get into the task and you find out pretty quickly that they probably don't know it as well as you'd hoped. And you can kind of sense that in the way that they say how they can provide that service. And when you found somebody who's like, you know what? Yeah. Like for me, somebody says, I'm interested in starting a podcast. Can you help? Yes. Like from me, there's no question. Like I am as confident in is anything in being able to help people get through that process. And I think that confidence comes out in what we say, right? In the way we say it. And people are looking for that. They're sensing that they need that in the conversation to know, yeah, this person is confident and knows their value proposition to this. To your example of the individual that could help people get better jobs, they could say that in a way that is like, yeah, you know what? I can do this.
Mhm.
And you just believe them, right? You believe
Mhm.
them in
Um,
that.
and part of it is just being tuned into, then what's the value that your customer most needs, right?
Mhm.
So to your point, Jim, there's people. I think part of it is you have to be clear about that and know, hey, is that value that you really provide, and is that value is that are you matched up with the right customer set? Is that
Mhm.
value that your customer really needs around that?
Mhm. Mhm.
I would tell you, I think this can be a really uncomfortable or scary conversation for people, because at some point it calls people to commit. I think that in the beginning, excuse me, people, excuse me, people have to be willing to give up being everything to everyone. And so I think when you're first, as in setting up a practice, when you're first coaching, you want to think that you can be everything to everybody. And part of it is, in particular, some of this may be motivated by just the financial viability that you got to generate, right? But you look at, when you're first starting out, you look at everything and you say, yeah, I can do that, or I could do this, and but the question is should you? Are you really the best person to do that? And where is the area where you've got unique value or unique expertise, where you really contribute something that's really powerful and unique? I love the thing again. I don't know. I apologize. I don't know the name of the person. It's Tudham Leadership Coaching. I love the thing that you wrote in here, beyond feeling better after working with me. That people feel healed after working together. Right. I think that's really useful. I think that's really useful, and I think that's useful. I think it's also thinking about, okay, as you start to get clearer and clearer, who needs that?
Mhm.
Who needs that? Who's the person that's going to find that most valuable? Um, as you're asking that yourself that question, it's really asking yourself, as a coach, where do I have a strength? Where do I deliver consistent near perfect performance? Where What am I most passionate about? But what's the area where people can count on consistent near perfect performance from me in that particular area? And I think that's the answer to the question. So hopefully, I think today has been useful. We've talked a lot about the elements of this, but this is really about how do you create what your brand is, and particularly what your value proposition is for the market. It starts with really looking at, what do you contribute, and looking through the lens of your strengths around that. Then thinking about what's the value around it, what's the value that people derive around it, how is that differentiated, and then who's the customer set that will benefit from those set? Who should your customers be? I think when you've got that kind of clarity, it gets easy for you to be able to stand up and say, this is what I do. This is who I am. This is what I do. This is what people count on me for. This is what I'm in business to do. Right?
Dean, I think we know your brand oftentimes in the community in this setting is to bring relevant, timely, well thought out learning, and people join us for that, right? I mean, you're that when I put this, we put this event on Eventbrite Monday, and it's Friday. That means there was 5 days, and it filled up. If I can use that term, it doesn't. There's really no measurement of it, but we got a ton of registrations between Monday and Friday. Typically I would need to promote it on Facebook, and I would need to, kind of blast these all around to get the kind of response that we got. Your reputation, your brand, your value preceded you on this, and it got a bunch of registrations without me really having to do any kind of work to get it there, right? That's the value you bring in this. And I think that some people would call that reputation. I think that's maybe another, you're known for that. And so I think I think that's a great example of as we think about this being, what are you known for? You're known for bringing great teaching to us.
Yeah.
I do want to open up to the chat. One second. I do want to open up to the chat to get some questions, but do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I'd love to take the questions. I was just going to say, that was a journey for me. And that was, I will tell you, was a strengths journey for me. Part of what I would say, particularly over the last 5 years, I've been asking myself these questions. Like, what is it that I want to contribute? What is the value that people derive? One of the things that was interesting and I think a little challenging for me was I realized at my core that who I am as a teacher. And it's funny because I think when I look at myself, I didn't, there were so many other things that I thought I should be, I had as pictures in my head of the value that I provided. And at the end of the day, when I really looked at what is it that I contribute and where am I good and where do I have something unique, part of my value is being effective as a teacher and particularly teaching people in these areas. And it sounds funny that you say, I mean, that's really my brand now, is really being a teacher, right, around this kind of stuff. And coming to terms with that and knowing that about myself and accepting that about myself and leaning into that, I think has given me a huge amount of really just deep fulfillment. It's interesting. I will tell you. So there's a new person on my team, joined my team in the last few weeks. And we've had a lot of conversation about strengths, as you can imagine. And she said, what if it's something you're good at, but that you don't really like doing, right? What if is something that you feel like you're good at, but you don't really like doing? It's like, well, yeah, but that's not really at your core. That contribution should be something that's deeply fulfilling for you, right? You may be competent at it. You may have some skill with it, but that's different than something that is fundamentally, I think that where you have that moment where you know for yourself, this is what I was called to do, right? This is why I'm on the earth, right? This is really what I was called to do. And I think people figuring that out, I think this is one angle into it, but people figuring that out, finding that out and leaning into that creates a huge amount of fulfillment. One of the things I'd like to suggest, I don't usually do this, but I'd love to, because of the nature of this forum, it's kind of one way, right? That's why I love the chat. I also would love it is if you're going to do some work with this, I'd love for you to post, maybe start a conversation on Facebook around this, Jim. But I'd love to hear what people are getting out of this and what they're doing with this. It'd be super interesting for me just to know if you take this on and you want to kind of do some work around this. I'd love to see that. I'd love to see that on Facebook. And so if you want to post on Facebook around it, gosh, I'd love to see that. I'd be super interested in what you come up with around that. So,
Dean, I got a question, and we'll facilitate those. Got a question from Cheryl, which I want to tweak a little bit. She says, I think it's especially important to realize you can't be all things to all people if you're an internal coach. We oftentimes speak to kind of the external, independent, certified coaching community when we're speaking. I want to spend in 2022 and 2023, I want to add to the vernacular. And if you're embedded, if you're an embedded coach, right?
Yeah.
What does this mean? I mean, as we think about our embedded coaches they're certified coaches in organizations, they're not maybe necessarily trying to do their own business. What's the tweak as they think about this internal value that they bring? Would you
That's
say
great.
anything different?
Yeah, I think yes. I don't know that I don't know if it's terribly different, but I do think it's unique. I think that when you're a coach and you're working inside of an organization, first of all, you got to understand um, the challenge that you run into. There's a few things there. The challenge that you run into is can I build trust with? Who is somebody that is going to trust me and trust the coaching that I provide? Sometimes, and it's just a hard truth. Sometimes if you're in HR and you say, "Hey, I want to coach people," people sometimes have a distrust of HR. So they look at it and they say, "Hey, you're an HR person. I don't know if I trust it." Now, I do think that's changing, but one is that can be a barrier sometimes, right? Sometimes I think it's really challenging if you're an internal coach and you're coaching people in an area that you don't have direct expertise in. I find this oftentimes you get people that are internal coaches that are trying to coach salespeople, but they've never really done business development or haven't been around business development, or they don't have. I've seen coaches, like we have coaches in our organization who coach business development people, and they've never had business development experience, but they really understand that talent profile really well, right? And so they're really good at coaching business development people, but it's because they're really embedded in what is the talent profile of somebody who does sales or business development. Sometimes you get internal coaches trying to coach salespeople and their instincts are bad, right? Because they don't really understand that profile. They're coaching salespeople to be less competitive or something, right? You know what I mean? And so you really have to understand that piece. The other thing that I think is just a hard truth, and I think this is true whether you're an internal coach or whether you're an external coach, is you're not going to be able to work with everybody. And it's really hard, particularly the more successful you are, is to know that some people you're just not going to click with some people. I had this happen. There's a gentleman who's one of our top course leaders and coaches in our organization, right? And he called me the other day and he said, "Look, I'm really upset. I just had a client say, hey, basically the client said, hey, we don't want to work with you, you know?"
Mm.
And he was like, "Gosh, I just feel, and this is somebody who is at the top of their game, right? They are one of the very best, but it was really upsetting." And that just happens sometimes. And it happens to all of us, right?
Mhm.
They're just people you're just not going to click with, and you're not going to be the one to coach them. And you have to kind of that's just the chemistry of human relationships, right? And so you have to kind of accept that you aren't going to be all things to all people, and that there are going to be folks that you're not going to be able to coach. And the right thing to do is to lean into the ones that you can. One of the early pieces of advice I got in my career was not to coach somebody who wasn't a request for my coaching.
Mm.
And so part of what I'm always listening for is there really an authentic request for my coaching? Otherwise, it just comes across like noise, and it's a distraction from them getting the coaching that they really do want and need.
Wise advice. A lot of great stuff in the chat room. We'll take this conversation kind of into the Facebook group. I just think for lots of individuals, this is as this was introduced to me at Gallup through our onboarding, and then I got the opportunity to work with employees, especially interns, onboarding, and we spent some time talking about how important this idea of personal brand is, both from any setting. I think about what's the personal brand that I bring as a dad to my kids, right? What's the value proposition? Because it's important, right? I think sometimes we think in the parental relationships that we have, however that fits in, whatever that is.
Yeah.
And I think about it all the time. What I get a limited set of moments with my own children. How am I bringing what do they find value in? And it's crazy because it's different for all five of them, right? And
Yeah.
I have to individualize and specialize my parenting for each
Beautiful.
one of for each one of my kids as I
Yeah.
think about what's the value I bring to them. Yeah.
Jim, that's a great analogy, and it's the way we should be doing with our customers, right? The value that one customer derives from us is not going to be the same as another customer,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And and also that the value that people derive is going to change over time too. just like with your kids, as they develop the value that they derive from you. And it's the same thing with clients. Over time, that value is going to change. It's going to evolve. Couple comments in the chat. I thought we just before we wrap today.
Yes.
Ed said, "I'm going to incorporate this brand into a workshop for teens, Latinas leading tomorrow." I love that, Ed. I think that's dynamite. And, particularly for people, as you're a teenager or a college student, or you're entering the workforce, thinking about this, that's a powerful time to be thinking about this. I think that's super useful. Rachna said, this topic is so relevant for me. I've been pondering on this as I'm setting myself up. Yeah, Rachna, I'm really interested in, and what do you come up with around this? I think it's really, as you think about this and you think about your unique value, be super interesting to know, okay, where did you come out on this, right? Brea said, yes, if we aren't intentional about creating our own narrative, people will interpret things a million different ways. Yeah, it goes back to the thing that we were talking about is there's lots of ways to be known in a community, but you want to be intentional and you want to be explicitly saying, this is what I aim to contribute. And this is this is the value that you can count on me for. This is the value you'll derive from working with me. Being able to intentionally create your own narrative. I love that way of saying it, Brea, is to be able to say, this is what I contribute. This is the value that people derive from working with me, right? And also to be able to listen, as Jim just pointed out, to be able to listen to individual clients and say, here's where I think you're really going to connect with the value that I provide. Here's the thing that I think uniquely for you is going to be consistent with that. Or to be able to say, hey, look, I've really listened to you. I hear what you need. I'm not the right guy for you. I'm not the right person to coach you. You need a coach who's really going to specialize in this, or somebody who really has expertise in this area. So knowing, to be able to know, and in some cases you may refer them to somebody else, right? But knowing what it is that you contribute and what value that people derive from you, very, very useful.
I love it, Dean. I think with that, we'll call it a wrap. And always appreciate your learning. My value proposition is to bring relevant content to our coaching community, not be the expert, but be the facilitator, right? Ask great questions, lead great conversations to help people, and then bring the community in the best way possible, most scalable way possible, right? We could do this with 1 million. We have 50 today, but we could have 1 million people out there doing this, right? And so you've kind of taught me in this. We've talked about this before. You've been part of that journey with the community with me in bringing, it's very, very clear what I do here, right? I don't try to be the expert, Jim. Just ask great questions.
And you do.
Thank you.
You do. Yeah.
Yeah,
you do.
I appreciate that. So, well, with that, we'll remind everyone to take full advantage of all the resources we do have available in Gallup Access. Catherine, I think, had asked how to the name of the Facebook group. Best way, if you haven't gotten in any of the groups, we have a special certified group, but a great place to start, easiest way to get in, facebook.com/groups/called-to-coach. That's kind of our big public group and a great place to start. You can ping me there if you're certified and you're not in our certified group. You can ping me there and we get you in that kind of group as well. You can find us on any social platform just by searching CliftonStrengths. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, maybe you're listening to this here and you're like, well, wait a minute, I can do this as a podcast. Search Called to Coach on any of the podcast app, or find CliftonStrengths on YouTube. Subscribe so you never miss an episode. We want to thank you for joining us here today and for your great comments that are out there as well. Great validation, Dean, that you and I are providing our brand, right? Our brand promise to the organization, and doing it as the power of two. And so, Dean, I appreciate your partnership in this as well. For those of you listening live, have a great weekend. We've got plenty of conversations just like this next week. So go to Gallup.com, go to Gallup.eventbrite.com if you want to join us for more of these live sessions. Love to have you there. Thanks for coming out. If you found this useful, and you should, we'd ask you that you share it. Thanks for joining us today. With that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.